Well, hello everybody, this is Paul Chek, and I'm here to talk to you today about the core of movement. I think this will be a fun topic for all of you. I suspect you will learn a lot of very interesting things. It'll make you think a lot differently about the core. At least that's my dream. If you're not watching the video version, you're probably going to want to have the PDF, which is accessible in the show notes. There's a lot of important images in this presentation that will help you understand what I'm sharing. And because I'm talking about a lot of concepts that are not so commonly understood, even by healthcare and medical professionals, unfortunately, it will help to see the images and diagrams that I have in the presentation. Well, the core is actually a concept that I popularized back when I started lecturing professionally in 1988. Nobody even knew what the concept of the core was. People just talked about the abs and the back, and they didn't really have a concept of the core. So when you look at my diagram, the dotted lines represent the muscle called the transverse abdominis, and that muscle has its name because its fibers run in the transverse plane, or they simply wrap around your body like a corset. When you draw your belly button in, you are using your transverse abdominis muscles to do that. Then you have B, that's the diaphragm, which is a key part of the core, very, very important aspect of the core. C, you have the deep stabilizer muscles of the spine, which are classically rotatories and multifidus. There are different branches that kind of are a hybrid crossover, such as semispinalis, spinalis, but we primarily refer to the deep stabilizers of the spine when talking about the core. Then below you have the pelvic floor muscles. Now, what makes the core so unique is that these muscles are neurologically connected via the spinal cord, and if you contract any one of them, it triggers contraction in the other ones. But in general, these muscles have to work together to stabilize the spine. The core is the foundation for the arms and legs. It's the locus of stability and functional movement. The core provides protection for the central nervous system. And if you look at my diagram on the right, it's important to know that the core is what's left if you take the arms and the legs off of the body. So if you remove the arms and the legs, you will have the pelvic girdle, the spine, the head, neck, and jaw. That's the core. So it provides protection for the entire brain and central nervous system because they are inherent to the core. The core provides visceral support, which means the word viscera means organ. So it provides visceral support and protection, or protection for your organs and glands that are inside you. It's essential to blood and lymphatic circulation. The core is the locus of viscerosomatic expression, which means organ, muscle, in this case, movement, or organ tissue expression. It's also deeply involved in breathing, hunger, thirst, sex, and birthing, urination, defecation, pumping, such as when you breathe, your diaphragm drops down, and that all causes shifts in the pressure inside your internal organs and in your lungs, which aids the heart. It's also involved in the creation of life force energy via stretching, movement, and is involved in your digestive and eliminative processes, all of which are essential to cultivating life force energy. So already you can see the core is the core of our being. It's very, very essential to our survival. So as I said earlier, the core includes the head, neck, and jaw. And as you can see by my diagram on the lower right of my slide, the core is influenced by and responds to influences from all cranial nerves. So all the nerves, such as the vagus nerve, oculomotor nerve, vestibular nerve, acoustic nerve, etc., they're all intimately involved in what we call the core. Because the core includes the brain and cranial nerves and is always under direct influence of the psyche, it is common for doctors and therapists to misdiagnose core dysfunction, such as back pain, as the actual cause of people's pain and challenges. So, in other words, they will diagnose low back pain or chronic rotator cuff pain or a neck pain or a knee pain or foot and ankle pain or a number of other things as that, not realizing those are commonly the symptoms of core dysfunction. And what I'd like to do now is show you why these types of treatments notoriously and to this day do not give good long-term results. I've had to rehab people that have had 5 surgeries on the same knee, for example, professional football players. Yet when I evaluated them, it was clear that because the core was not working, they could not stabilize the knee. So whenever the core is not functioning, it will produce compensations in the extremities that will lead to faulty recruitment patterns of the muscles, faulty movement patterns in joints, wear and tear of cartilage, microtrauma or macrotrauma to ligaments, depending on the situation. For example, a lot of anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments are the injuries are the result of core dysfunction. You can see the Chek totem pole, which is a system I designed initially for my own research to help people so that I could understand what causes what in the body. So for years, I spent asking what causes that. Simple question, what causes that? So on your screen, you see the results of what took me about 15 years to ultimately figure out. At the top of the totem pole, you'll see a bird, which represents the soul. The top part represents the masculine energy or the aspect of ourself that is conscious. The black area underneath represents the dark area represents the unconscious aspects of ourself. The moon represents our capacity for self-reflection, and that combined symbology represents the psyche. Quite simply, the psyche is the top of the totem pole because it is our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs that have the most powerful effect on all regulatory systems of our body. We can choose to commit suicide and stop our heart from beating and stop ourselves from breathing, which the body never wants to do. So we have to override the survival instincts of the body and do something the body itself would not do in order to kill ourselves. So simply put, the psyche is more powerful than any system in the body and can and does cause significant problems in all regions in the totem pole or all aspects of the body control systems. Now, before I explain the rest of the symbols, I want to point out it's called a survival reflex totem pole because what I identified is what reflex systems in the body are responsible for keeping us alive in nature. Should we be hungry? Should we have a threat such as a tooth knocked out or teeth that don't fit together, such as eating the wrong foods or poisonous foods or not getting enough food, etc. So how does the body organize itself to maximize survivability? Because those are the deepest reflexes that have the greatest influence. And because very few people ever look into these things, they aren't aware of how these systems are causing common problems that are often mistaken to be musculoskeletal problems, digestive troubles, and other things like that. So below the psyche, you have breathing. Oxygen is the most important nutrient for our survival. The average person breathes about 25,900 times a day. That's quite a lot of activity. Oxygen is essential to our metabolism and it is vital. So anything that disrupts our ability to breathe will cause compensations in every system below. So what the totem pole shows you, quite simply, is if there's a system above that needs to be balanced, the body will do anything it can do to try to create balance to improve the function of that system, because it's more important for your survival than the ones below. Therefore, it will sacrifice inferior systems in order to enhance survivability. So we started with the psyche, we got breathing, then we go to mastication. Anything that disrupts the ability for our teeth to fit together will cause compensations. You only have one set of adult teeth. If they wear out, it's trouble. If your jaw doesn't work, you can't eat, you'll starve to death. And there's so much more about the jaw mechanism that I can't get into, but it's extremely complex, has a lot of neurological input. It links to your meridians and much more. Next, we have the visual system. The visual system is extremely important for orienting ourselves in space or proprioception, seeing what wants to eat us and what we want to eat, and all the things you know already are important for vision. And visual dysfunction or disorders are very common causes of back pain and chronic orthopedic disorders. And I did a lot of research into that and have found many, many cases of people that had chronic back pain, neck pain, structural pain, scoliosis, and many other things that were the result of visual challenges, and have had to use optometrists, behavioral optometrists, and other experts to help people heal. Next, we have the auditory vestibular system. Your vestibular system is important for balancing and knowing where your head is at relative to your body and where your body's at relative to your head. It works intimately with the upper cervical spine, which is the system below it, and it coordinates your writing reflexes and tilting reflexes. And then you have hearing, which is also essential for survival. So anything that threatens those systems will immediately cause changes throughout the systems below. And there are cases where changes can be experienced above. They're not always just below, but because of the importance of the systems, it's rare for the body to make sacrifices above because those systems are so vital. And I've organized them in the order of survival importance. So there are exceptions to every rule, but these things generally turn out to be true. Next, we have the upper cervical spine, which includes your atlas, the top cervical vertebra, which your skull rides on, and the axis, and the junction between the axis and C3. That's a very important region of our body and spine, because that region of the spine rotates the most, has the least ligamentous support, and therefore is the most unstable. The upper cervical spine is the most commonly subluxed region of the spine, which means out of alignment and therefore altered function. And the spinal cord, the dura of the spinal cord, attaches up at the atlas and axis, and then down later we'll get to where it attaches below. But any changes in the intricacy of those joints can put tension, what's called adverse mechanical tension, through the central nervous system, leading to compensations that can be very detrimental to your ability to move, can cause a lot of pain, and is a focus of specialization and study for specialists in orthopedic rehabilitation, because there's a lot of adverse mechanical tension issues in the central nervous system that get overlooked. Below that, we get into the glands and the organs, which, I don't think you need to have too much education on the importance of those. So anything that disrupts the ability for your glands and organs to function will cause compensations in how the body moves and how your posture is oriented. the health and vitality or survivability of joints, connective tissues, muscles, cartilage, etc. The next system below relates to psychoneuroimmunology and the effects of our thoughts, words, and emotions on our internal systems. So this is what I call a floating symbol. It relates to the limbic section of the brain, which processes emotion. And here you see a picture of a heart with a crack in it, which stands for the saying, so-and-so broke my heart. A stomach with a lightning bolt hitting it, which represents the saying, so-and-so makes me sick to my stomach, or this or that makes me sick to my stomach, like a lot of you are probably feeling as you read the Epstein papers. And then down below, you have a lightning bolt through the colon, which represents so-and-so is a pain in the ass, or this or that is a pain in the ass. And so what I'm pointing out here is that we often don't realize that the words we use and the beliefs we attach to them cause immediate hormonal and physiological changes in our body. And the more we do that, the more the body manifests the very belief, behavior, and words in physical form in our body. And there's been many cases in my career, for example, where people had very negative relationships with their bodies, either for religious ideologies or for frustration that their body wouldn't heal. Below that, you have the sacrum, and the sacrum is linked to the pelvic girdle, but the key issue here is the sacrum and what's called the coccyx, which is the tip of the sacrum, which is where what is called the filum terminale attaches. That's the tail of the central nervous system. And you have several key nerve roots that come down there and feed the pelvic floor, and the sciatic nerve and the nerves that feed the legs pass through those notches you see there. Anything that throws the sacrum out of position or stops its mechanical function will result again in adverse mechanical tension in the central nervous system. And because that nervous system, the dura, the casing of the nervous system, attaches to the upper cervical spine, it often causes immediate shifts in the way the body is held posturally, statically, and dynamically, causes shifts in the carriage of the head, leads to disturbance in weight balance, and lots of chronic problems. Now we're at the bottom of the totem pole, and here's where it gets very interesting. You'll see at the bottom a little picture representing a slave, because all the joints there are called slave joints in my system. So that means that all the vertebra from C3 to L5, which is the vertebra that rests on your sacrum, are slaves to everything above that I've just covered. Your elbow, your shoulder, elbow, wrist, and hand joints, your hip, knee, ankle, and foot joints all serve as the slaves to the masters above. So just like you have a rank system in the military designed hopefully to keep you alive so that the most important decisions are made at the highest level, and they step down to the lowest level, your survival systems are oriented so that the most important survival systems have the power to control all systems below them to enhance your survivability. For more information on the Chek totem pole, you can watch my video on YouTube, and that is just a small sampling of a very comprehensive approach to analysis of the totem pole systems so that we don't overlook things when we're doing rehabilitation and trying to help people regain their health and their vitality.
Millions of people are carrying parasites, and most don't even know it. In fact, the chances are good that you have one or more parasites inside you right now, leeching off your nutrients and strength. But before you get all freaked out about it, here is some good news. Organifi's Parasite Cleanse Kit contains a unique and specialized blend of carefully chosen natural elements that help locate, kill, and remove unwanted guests and pests from the body. Like a magnet finding iron in the sand, these ingredients adhere to the toxins and parasites and pull them out of hiding, ultimately removing them from your body. This two-step combination of 100% natural ingredients includes the Parasite Cleanse capsules and the Bind and Restore tincture, creating an easy-to-use cleanse that is perfect to help get rid of your unwanted guests. Now is a great time to try Organifi's Parasite Cleanse Kit and save 20%. Go to Organifi.com/Chek20 and use the promo code Chek20. That's Organifi.com/CHEK20 and use the code Chek20 for a 20% discount.
Now, the abdominal wall or core is highly complex. Just to give you an example, as you can see in my diagram there on the left, there are 8 motor nerves feeding each half of the abdominal wall, which run from thoracic 7, T7 to lumbar 2, L2. In comparison, most muscles in the body have one primary and one secondary motor nerves. So your deltoids are C5, your biceps C6, your triceps C7, etc. So that's a lot of nerve inputs, which means a lot of motor control. Each section of your spinal cord is like a mini brain inside of itself, where you have a motor and sensory nerve coming from that region of the spine. So each C, T, or L represents where a motor nerve comes out and a sensory nerve distribution. So you've got a lot of neurological control over the abdominal wall, far more vast than any other region in your body, as far as the motor system is concerned. The lower abdomen has very unique motor functions for stabilization and movement. And I remember earlier in my career, there used to be all sorts of arguments in the literature as to whether there was actually upper and lower abdominal muscles, which shocked me because it showed me that all these so-called experts had not studied anatomy very well at all. But what's interesting is if you study embryology, as the embryo develops, what are the buds that create the low back muscles migrate down, become the pelvic floor muscles and continue up to the umbilicus to become the lower abdominal muscles. And the lower abdominal muscles are supplied by the ilioinguinal iliohypogastric nerves, T12 and L1. So they actually have a unique innervation that kind of isolates them neurologically from those above. So what's important about that is it's very, very common to find people with low back pain that do not have normal lower abdominal muscle function, which is important to the stabilization of the pelvic girdle and sacroiliac joints and the hip, knee, ankle, and foot. So it's really common to see hip, knee, ankle, and foot injuries in people that don't realize they have a dysfunction potentially in the spine or in the lower abdominal muscles or the back muscles, all of which can disrupt control of the lower extremity. And the core, if it's not working, can disrupt control of the extremities, period, upper and lower. So these are important things to realize. And as I'll show you later, these muscles have very important connections to your internal organs and respond to them in many ways. To show you how the inner unit, which we talked about earlier as the diaphragm, deep spinal stabilizers, pelvic floor, and transverse abdominis muscles predominantly, it's a little more technical than that, which I go into in the actual scientific core conditioning course, but for a podcast, I'll keep it fairly understandable. I created this diagram to help people in my classes understand how these two systems work together. So if you see my diagram of a pirate ship with a skull on top of the mast, which is made out of mobile segments, just like your spine, then you can look at the letters. The letter A that's holding the flag up would represent the rectus abdominis. B would represent the oblique abdominal muscles. C would represent the back extensor muscles. And D would represent the intrinsic stabilizers of the spine, such as the rotatories and multifidus, which are part of the inner unit. So the point I'm trying to make with this simple diagram is that if you have a mast of mobile segments, if the intrinsic stabilizers were not properly balanced in order to stabilize the mast, the more tension you put in the abdominals, the erectors, or the obliques, the more likely you would be to collapse the mast. And that turns out to be pretty much exactly what happens. Is as you over exercise or traumatize any one or combination of these muscles, if it is not corrected and brought into balance with the inner unit, it will cause changes in posture, changes in joint mechanics, and lead to pain and dysfunction, as sure as I'm sitting here talking to you. Now, the inner unit works with the outer unit muscles, and I will be describing the difference in some of the intrinsic nature of these muscles as we go. The outer unit consists primarily of what are called phasic muscles, which are really geared towards faster movements or heavier lifts or more dynamic movements, not so much postural control and stabilization. Inner unit systems are for stabilizing and keeping things together. Now, these muscles work together in what are often called slings or sling systems. These are the primary ones. There's been a number of books written trying to identify different slings, but so far, when I read them, it looks to me like the authors are just stretching and using their imagination. These ones I've researched very thoroughly, and the connections are very, very clear. And so in the top left diagram with the sort of Paleolithic man carrying the animal home after hunting it, you see the gluteus maximus on one side working with the opposite latissimus dorsi, often called the lats in the gym, putting tension through the thoracolumbar fascia, the big white sheet of connective tissue in the low back, and that creates stabilization for the pelvic girdle and the sacroiliac joint. And then directly diagonally below, you have the anterior oblique system. And so the external oblique on one side with the internal oblique and the adductors on the other side create stability not only in rotation, but in the frontal plane, which works in concert with the lateral system, which is the adductors and hip abductors on one side and the quadratus lumborum on the opposite side, and some fibers of the internal oblique abdominal muscle, which you can see some of the fibers down here. Now, this system down here, called the deep longitudinal system, is probably one of the more recent ones that are identified, but what the research showed, and people like Sergei Grakovetsky, who wrote The Spinal Engine, and others have written extensively about this. Here you have muscles that go from the great toe, and these are the peroneal muscles, and connect into the lateral hamstring, which then puts tension through the sacrotuberous ligament, and that tension crosses through the sacroiliac ligaments and influences the erector spinae on the opposite side, which goes all the way up to the head. And these muscles are very important for creating efficiency in gait, so you can use the elastic energy stored in tendons, and so you can dissipate shock out of the body before it gets up to the head, because the typical person gets 4 to 7 times body weight in ground reaction forces when jogging and running, which is a lot of kinetic energy And if the brain was getting too rattled, it could be very problematic for the brain. So these are systems of muscles that work together, and a lot of people's injuries in sports or lack of performance in sports and chronic pain come from something causing one or more of these muscles to not work, therefore disrupting the synergy with the muscles in each of the slings. And all of these muscles work together. There isn't any one of them that works in isolation. They're all an integrated system of muscles that stabilize and move the body. And it's important to remember here that even though I'm talking about stabilizer muscles, inner unit muscles, and phasic or prime mover muscles, even the big muscles of the body, such as the glutes and the lats, actually do have stabilizing functions in specific activities, specific postures, or situations. So we don't want to make the mistake of being too isolationist in our viewpoint. But as I'll show you, there are specific qualities to these muscles that give you definite hints as to what their actual primary functions are. But in general, your phasic muscles move the body, and your stabilizer muscles stabilize the body to protect the joints from being damaged and to keep the body so that it can generate force and transfer force efficiently through the kinetic chain or the musculoskeletal system. Now, when it comes to movement, it's very interesting that research clearly shows that we have centrally generated movement. This is the case anytime we are not using an external form of support, such as a wall or a floor or a cane. Like if you're laying on your back doing abdominal exercises, then that changes the whole thing, because your body will not use the core or any muscle any more than it has to, because in nature we had to go for periods without food, and we had to become very, very efficient. So the body actually is designed to be as efficient as it possibly can. So because we have to stabilize something before we can move it effectively without causing damage, what we find in studying lots of research is that the core is what initiates stabilization, which leads to stabilization of the pelvic girdle and the shoulder girdle. And that causes like a wave effect, and then the leg and the arm are stabilized. So whenever you turn your stabilizers on, such as when you bend over to pick something off the floor like you see, there's going to be a wave from the transverse abdominis, pelvic floor, deep stabilizers and diaphragm, progressively out to the hip and shoulder girdle, down to the leg and arm. And this happens very quickly within milliseconds. Now you see a picture of my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy there. That's because in the book, I show you several tests you can do to identify if you have core stabilizer dysfunction, and give you corrective exercises and diet and lifestyle approaches to bring balance back into the system, which is essential to keep you out of pain and keep your body functioning correctly. Because as soon as these systems don't work correctly, you develop what are called compensatory movement patterns. And not only do they cause the joints to be loaded and moved incorrectly and lead to pain eventually, because you'll go from compensation to having pain in the muscles that are getting overworked by compensating to decompensation. And that's usually when you have more serious injuries than just pain. Now, to demonstrate visually and undeniably how the core organizes movement, I've got a video that was given to me to use by permission from Sergei Grakovetsky, the author of the famous book called The Spinal Engine. And this patient was born with a congenital defect. He has no legs, and as you can see, he's got almost no arms. And partway through the video, they're going to block the lower portion of the video And what you will see is if you were on the other side of a fence watching this man walk by, you probably would not know that he didn't have legs, because it is the core or the spinal engine that drives the arms and legs in movement, in functional movement, where you're not externally supported. And so there you go. That's quite an amazing video. I'm very grateful to be able to share that with you and Chek professionals, because it really drives the point home undeniably. Next, it's a concept here that I popularized a very long time ago when I had a full head of hair, and that is that you cannot fire a cannon from a canoe. So here in my image on the screen, you see someone trying to drive a golf ball while standing in a canoe. That's likely to lead to the golfer going for a swim because the boat moves underneath them. And much the same would happen if you tried to drive a golf ball on freshly cleaned ice, like in a hockey arena, because you can't anchor yourself to the ground. So we not only have to have good anchorage for what we do, which is why, for example, footing is so important in sports and why we have to have adequate connection to the ground, but our core is essentially the stabilizing function. So here, the analogy is if your core is not working and you try to do an explosive movement or lift a heavy weight, you're unlikely to be able to lift it without hurting yourself. And if you're putting your joints at risks or threatening nerve root compression or stretching ligaments too much, there are fail-safe mechanisms built into the body to shut down the motor neurons that fire the prime mover muscles. And many, many athletes that I rehabbed got significant improvements in performance, whether it be weightlifting or driving a golf ball or throwing a javelin, once their core was working correctly, because without any additional training, they were able to stabilize their spine and protect the nervous system and not overload ligaments and joint capsules and trigger off mechanoreceptive reflexes that shut the motor neurons down. And so they were often just amazed at how they could get such performance enhancements doing what looked like very simple exercises, but were designed specifically to reactivate the muscles that had been shut off, often by internal problems, diet and lifestyle issues, mental, emotional issues, or soft tissue damage or joint dysfunction that needed manual therapy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's two primary types of stability we need to be thinking about when we're talking about human movement, and that is static and dynamic stability, because they're prerequisites to success and consistency in most work, exercise, and sports environments. Static and dynamic postural stability provide the foundation for developing strength, power, and biomotor abilities. Bio means life, motor means movement. So, for example, you can see my picture of a soccer player about to kick the ball. The stance leg is creating static stability. He's anchoring himself in order to explosively swing his kicking leg dynamically. If he cannot stabilize the stance leg, it will lead to inhibition in the motor system, which will then disrupt his ability to kick efficiently, because if he could generate maximum force without stability in the core, pelvis, knee, ankle, and foot, that amount of force could actually damage connective tissues, damage ligaments, and damage muscles, and create shear in joints. The three enemies of joints are compression, torsion, and shear as a general rule of thumb. So the stabilizer system is always working to manage compression, torsion, and shear in joints. Whenever you have too much compression, torsion, or shear in joints, you start getting wear and tear on ligaments and cartilage and connective tissues and muscles, which try to stabilize actively, become hyperactive, which leads to soft tissue dysfunction, such as trigger point development and the accumulation of metabolic waste and lactic acid in muscles, which then creates an acidic environment, which creates a perpetual pain, spasm, speed feedback cycle and leads to a worsening, kind of like a snowball effect. Things just get worse and worse, which is one of the reasons why most elite sports teams have professional sports massage therapists working with them to identify things in advance, because the muscles will often broadcast stability problems and internal problems well in advance of injury. Below that, you see a kayaker who must stabilize their body in the kayak and their torso so they have an adequate foundation from which to put force through their paddle. And if the kayaker couldn't do that, then they wouldn't be able to move the boat effectively. And if they kept trying to do it, they would probably almost guaranteed to have an injury. Now that we've gone through core stabilization, we can look at how force is generated. Again, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe. So you can see that the golfer has to be anchored to the ground by the feet. And so when it comes to generating force, the force has to be generated from the foot and ankle and leg. And that effort travels up to the pelvis and the core. And those big muscles accelerate the club. So think of the foot and the legs like the handle of a whip. Think of the core like the body of the whip, and think of the arms, wrist, and hand as the tip of the whip that cracks when you crack a whip. So we want to understand that force generation has to begin at the point of anchoring. Now, if you're in a sport like wrestling where you're applying force from your hands and your hands are on the ground, it would be the same scenario, just the arm and the hand would take the place of what is here, the foot and the ankle. And in my program design, advanced program design, and in Chek training, we go through many different types of scenarios for different sports, such as surfing, motocross racing, gymnastics, etc., so that Chek professionals learn how to actually design corrective and high-performance exercise programs that work, instead of just being a bunch of exercise in the gym that makes you look good but not perform better, which is another big problem out there. Now we'll look at how the body actually stabilizes, and I'll put this into fairly simplistic terms. This methodology or way of relating to the stabilizer system was developed by a genius chiropractor named Major Bertrand Desjardins, who wrote several excellent books and was truly a genius. And it's called the RC factor, and it's directly related to how we stabilize our spine and how we hold optimal posture and what happens when our systems are out of balance. You see a bodybuilder with the classic posture that goes hand in hand with doing too much crunches, or too many crunches off the floor, or too much abdominal exercise without adequate back extension exercise, which causes the head to come forward, the chest to drop down, and the curves of the spine to increase, and the pelvis to tilt forward, which you can see muscles in red. Those ones are shortened and tightened, and the green ones are respectively lengthened and weakened. Now, the red muscles are classic tonic muscles, and the green ones are classically phasic muscles. So the way the body differentiates, when we're born, we don't yet have a differentiated motor system. All the muscles of the musculoskeletal system, aside from the smooth muscles in the organs, are not specified yet. So it's through infant development, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, that the movements that we do and the way we encounter gravity trigger the adaptation of these muscles to do their specific roles. For example, if you could to somehow raise a child in water, and then at, say, 5 or 6 years of age, put them on land, they would probably not be able to stand up for more than a few seconds before their body would start to collapse into itself. So let's just look a little bit at the difference between these types of muscles. Tonic muscles are ideally suited to posture, stabilization, and workloads of longer duration, and they have more slow twitch muscle fibers, therefore a predominantly aerobic metabolism, which means they can go for longer periods of time, but they need oxygen delivery through the blood system to keep running for long periods of time. These tonic muscles react to overuse, underuse, abuse, such as trauma, or disuse, such as completely being sedentary as opposed to just lack of exercise. Someone, say, for example, forced into bed rest in the hospital due to a coma, by shortening and tightening and becoming hyperactive. The aerobic fibers have a lower threshold of stimulation. So as soon as the body starts to move or is in pain, they get excited very easily. So they're kind of like workaholics, especially when the body's out of balance. The phasic muscles, which are ideally suited to movement and rapid explosive movement, they're also suited to short-term loading and have an anaerobic metabolism because they're predominantly fast twitch in composition, and they react to overuse, underuse, abuse, or disuse by the opposite. They lengthen and weaken. So here you see one of the most common postures in my bodybuilder here that I have had to rehab in countless bodybuilders and athletes of many, many types, particularly those in explosive sports or sports where they're dealing with high forces and high weights, which is a lot of them, or anybody that has imbalances within the glands and the organs, or who has unresolved trauma, or who has mental emotional stress. Whenever you're under mental emotional stress, there's a very characteristic reaction in the body, and it turns out that the tonic muscles, the postural muscles, respond first. Now, I go into this in much greater depth and detail in Chek practitioner training. I'm just trying to give you a general overview so that hopefully you understand your own body better. And by the end of my podcast today, you might begin to look at yourself and say, oh my God, no wonder. Or, oh wow, I really need to be careful about my diet. Or I need to go have my eyes checked. Or, oh my God, I didn't know that my teeth not fitting together so well could do all this. And which is why I began with the totem pole. So again, imbalances in the tonic phasic muscle systems commonly lead to faulty posture, joint dysfunction, and chronic injury or pain.
Health isn't just one thing, it's everything working together. And one of the fastest growing areas in health and wellness is integrated health, the middle ground between fitness and rehab. People who follow this path see real long-term results, and this field provides amazing opportunities for those looking for a career change or upgrade. The Chek Institute has been educating Chek practitioners for over 30 years. They learn a step-by-step system that integrates advanced assessments, functional movement, and lifestyle coaching as a unified approach, allowing them to help their clients find lasting success that simply can't be achieved by just following a single pathway. But sometimes getting started on a new path can be challenging. That's why we created the new Chek Integrated Health Foundation program, building on Paul Chek's system that's been refined for over 30 years and practiced by more than 70,000 Chek-trained professionals worldwide. It's self-paced with lifetime access, community, payment plans, and limited time bonuses. When you complete it, you'll be able to run a complete client process, screen lifestyle factors, assess movement, design client-centered plans, and deliver a high-end service session after session so your work becomes referable, respected, and built to last. So whether you're looking for a career change and wanting a roadmap, or you're a fitness trainer tired of commoditized sessions, or maybe a medical professional frustrated by poor follow-through between appointments, the new Chek Integrated Health Foundation program can help you find success and fulfillment. Go to paul.chekinstitute.com/Spirit Gym to learn more about the brand new Chek Integrated Health Foundation program.
So we're going to now get into infant development and my Primal Pattern movement system, which will explain a lot of things that are important to understand. But we have to get clear on what functional exercise is. Back when I began consulting for professional sports teams, for example, it was common that these athletes were all using Cybex and hammer strength and leg presses and hamstring curls, and they had a lot of problems and often were not performing well. And often the more they trained in the gym, the worse they got on the sports field, the court, or boxing ring. In fact, when I was a fighter, as a young man in my early 20s, well, I started fighting when I was 12, but when I fought on the Army boxing team, the coaches used to see me lifting weights and they were scared. They would say, Paul, don't do that because it slows fighters down. And I said to them, well, you've seen me knocking people out. Am I slow? Has it decreased my punching power? And they said, no, we're curious as to how it is that that's happening for you, which is one of the reasons I became trainer amongst several other things. But the problem is that if you don't use your body to condition in ways that are directly applicable to how you're going to use it in your work or sports environment, then your conditioning will not only not help you in your work or sports environment, it can have a detrimental effect. So what you see on my screen is a bunch of very functional environments, from lifting weights to see me in my front yard to my buddy Mike Salemi, who is a world-class athlete, but has got many Masters championships in kettlebell, who I rehabbed from a serious injury, to roofers working on roofs, to mountain biking, to firemen holding a charged fire hose, which has tremendous amounts of pressure, and I've rehabbed lots of firemen in my career. So a functional exercise is any exercise done without external support that improves your ability to perform activities of daily living, work, and/or your chosen sport or recreational activities. Simply put, that's what a functional exercise is. If you're doing a hamstring curl, well, show me a sport where you're laying on your stomach and you increase performance by just bending your knees. I would say most gyms are just full of garbage that's actually decreasing people's athletic ability and functional ability. It might make you look better in the mirror, but I've met a lot of fit, sick athletes that are broken. So when it comes to infant development, again, this is a very comprehensive field. Chek professionals get quite a lot of training on infant development. It's far deeper than I can even really touch on in just a little bit of time on a podcast. But if you see the pictures that show the sequences, that shows you the progressive movements that the infant goes through first to pick its head up, which is how it begins to develop a cervical curvature by putting gravitational load on the neck extensors, which then causes them to become tonic because the child holds its head up for long periods of time. Then it progressively goes into mammalian posture, which helps it develop a thoracic curvature. Then it starts pulling itself up, as you can see in the third row, which initiates the development of a lumbar curvature. And those three curvatures are critical to normal movement of the human spine. So when it comes to infant development, it's the necessary progression for tonic phasic muscle differentiation. In other words, to give us the ability to stabilize properly, hold joints together, and to be able to move and develop force to move heavy objects or to move explosively without falling apart. Each step from the reptilian to mammalian to walking is necessary, as I said, for developing spinal curvatures, and each step develops the necessary ability to support the body in functional movement, without which we wouldn't survive in nature. The field of infant development is quite mind-blowing. In the year 2000, I believe, if I remember right, I went to the Czech Republic and I did an advanced training program with some of the most elite pioneers ever in musculoskeletal rehab, including Carol Levitt, who wrote the excellent book Manipulative Therapy and the Rehabilitation of the Locomotor System, and Vladimir Yonda, who did mountains of pioneering research on how the body moves and how to rehab the body. Both of them were doctors of rehabilitation or physiatrists. And I also studied the Vojta approach to infant development. Dr. Vojta did 50 years of research in the Czech Republic on infant development and identified many very fascinating things that are still used today by a group of therapists that are experts in the Vojta approach to infant development called Vojta therapists. And I had the pleasure of being trained by a Vojta therapist in the Czech Republic and saw some pretty wild things, which I might talk about in a minute here. Dr. Vojta identified something quite profound. On the right of my screen, you can see points. There's 11 of them identified on your screen that are where a child will naturally put pressure when they're laying on the ground. Remember, we evolved outside in nature, not in houses and on fluffy beds and things like that, which is another reason we have so much infant development problem, because many parents are clueless as to how to prepare the environment for a child to have normal infant development. So if you have hard floors in the house, it can disrupt infant development. And if you have toxic floorings, you can cause problems. So if you have small children or you're going to have a baby, it's very important to have about a 2-inch thick, firm, not mushy mat made of organic materials such as organic rubber and organic coverings, because the materials can poison children while they're learning infant development. They put everything in their mouth, as most of you would know. So what Vojta recognized through his research is that these points are reflex points that connect through the nervous system into the brain and activate software that is already innate and is part of our development through nature, through the kingdom of nature. The human body is kind of the tip of the evolutionary sword. In fact, if you study embryology, there's times when the fetus looks like a fish. There's times when it looks like a seahorse. There's times when it looks like a reptile. And you can actually see the evolutionary sequence that led to the development of the human body right in infant development. And so each of these stages is connected to different aspects of the spinal cord and brainstem in particular, and also the limbic system and ultimately the whole brain. But what Vojta found is that it doesn't matter how old you are, if you do the right movements and put pressure on these points in the right sequence, you will activate the software that integrates the body. Now, it doesn't just integrate the musculoskeletal system or motor system. It integrates the brain, the nervous system, the motor system, the glands, and the organs. And it has a direct impact on physical, physiological, and psychological development. And I wish I could go into all the different types of cases I've seen and worked with to highlight some of these things, but that would require multiple podcasts. For those of you interested, an excellent book that is readable by the general public is Wisdom of the Body Moving by Linda Hartley, an introduction to body-mind centering. She shows you very clearly how infant development is essential to integrating all aspects of the body, from how your glands and organs work, to how you digest and eliminate, to how your brain works, to which leads to how you manage thoughts and emotions, and on it goes. So infant development training and study for me was one of the most powerful advances in my understanding of how to rehabilitate people. Now, one of the things about infant development exercises is you should not share them publicly on video. Czech professionals are told to never share these by video, because if they're done wrong, then they don't work properly. And if you do an exercise wrong, you drive it into the motor system and create compensatory patterns that lead to problems. It takes about 30 300 to 3,500 reps based on research to develop a motor program, but on average takes 3,500 to 5,000 repetitions of corrective exercise by a skilled therapist to recondition the system. If you can do it, the more pain there is involved, the harder it is to do. But the moral of the story is training to failure is training to fail. That's another illness in the exercise industry. When I was given the beautiful opportunity to train with the Russian Olympic weightlifting team while I was lecturing in Moscow a number of years ago, when I was a younger, stronger man, one of the things I noticed, and one of my buddies, who's the one that brought me there, he was a world champion in the clean and jerk. These guys never trained to failure. Every single rep was perfect. Their last rep looked just like their first couple of reps. They didn't train themselves into bad form. So we have some concepts, unfortunately, that are rampant in the West, largely from the bodybuilding community, that have made their way into athletic conditioning that have been very, very detrimental on many levels. Next, I'm going to talk about my Primal Pattern movement systems. Now, the Primal Pattern movement system is something I developed, but I had the question in my mind, as I've shared in a previous podcast with the authors of the excellent book, Biotra. Why is it that our bodies are built the way they are? Why do certain muscles have certain amounts of fast or slow twitch? Why do muscles run at certain angles in some areas and not others? And so I had studied a number of different fields and had identified a concept called the selective pressures of nature. And so the big question I had in my mind, what movements would we have had to do to survive in nature? In other words, if there was a movement we couldn't do and it would threaten our survivability, what were those movements? So I spent quite a lot of time looking at, studying, and writing down. Sometimes I have 3-4 whiteboards and blackboards full of exercises, and I would look at them from a biomechanical and a kinesiological perspective and other perspectives, neurological perspective. And I would say, okay, which movement is dependent on what movement? In other words, what's primary and what's secondary? For example, if you throw a ball, you have 3 movements: a lunge, a twist, and a push. Now, if the lunge doesn't work properly, you will end up probably wearing your back or your shoulder out because you'll have to overuse them to accelerate the ball. For example, a baseball pitcher. I'll tell you an example. I had a professional pitcher come to me that had had 2 rotator cuff surgeries. His team sent him to me to figure out why he kept having these chronic rotator problems. And long story made short, I identified that he had what's called turf toe, which is damage to the joint of the big toe. And in order to walk properly and throw a ball, you have to be able to dorsiflex or lift your toe at least 60 degrees off the ground, or you can't step across your foot properly. And when I tested him, I found that he could not step across his foot properly, so he was accelerating his trunk, which caused forced external rotation of his shoulder to wind his rotator cuff up like a rubber band, which then he would kind of cause a cracking of the whip action to make the ball go fast, but it kept causing damage to his rotator cuff. It turned out the damage in his great toe was so much that I had to take him to a special foot doctor to develop what's called a rocker shoe for him. But once he had that rocker shoe and could use his leg properly, he was able to throw that ball 100 miles an hour, 95 to 100 miles an hour, without shoulder pain and continue his career. So there's an example of primary movements and the integration of movements. So we must also remember that all adults must clean, feed, nurture, and protect, especially their young and each other, to survive in nature. And so I found, by doing an analysis of which movements were most fundamental, that there were 7 of them. So of the 7 movements, squatting is very, very important. we had to spend a lot of time squatting. Remember, we didn't have furniture for most of our evolution. We ate on the ground, we pooped on the ground, we peed on the ground, we squatted to have meetings and communicate. No chairs. And we, as human beings, have a unique situation because we're the only animal in nature that has to pump fecal material uphill. We have to move feces from where your appendix is up the ascending colon, around a corner, and then down the descending colon into the sigmoid in order to have a bowel movement. And that's why we're designed to squat. If you look at all the ways we squat, mothers helping dress kids, people getting things out from cupboards, picking things up off the ground. Here you can see a catcher in the squat position, an ump in something close to the squat position. All you got to do is pay attention to your own daily life, and you'll see if you can't squat, you're going to have to compensate, and that's probably going to cause you some kind of an injury. My rule in rehab is if you can't, you must. If you hurt your back squatting and you can't squat, I, as your therapist, must rehabilitate you so that you can squat again, or you're just going to have more problems. And that approach was very successful, but it led to a lot of confusion with medical doctors and physical therapists and the whole medical profession, because they were trained, if you hurt your back squatting, you should never squat again, which goes completely against the principles of nature. Then we had to lunge. You didn't kill a deer and ask it to follow you home. You had to carry it home. So we had to go. We didn't have nice pathways and roadways. We had to step across logs and creeks and all rocks and all sorts of things. So we had to use that pattern for hiking, climbing, and we use it today for work, going, even partially lunging upstairs. It's a slightly different pattern, but it's quite similar to the lunge. So we can't survive in nature without a lunge pattern. We had to bend, and we bend all the time, and bending and picking up a load is probably the most common way people injure their backs, especially if they twist, such as reaching across your body to grab a suitcase off a conveyor belt at an airport. I've had piles of people injure themselves that way. So the bend pattern relates to anything where we bend our body and our spine, such as hunting, cooking, building shelter, and the many other situations in which we have to bend. Here you can see an athlete bending herself over the high bar. And we had to push. We had to push to build shelter, to gather, and to protect ourselves. And they didn't have a bench press to strengthen their pushing muscles, and laying on your back to strengthen your pushing muscles actually doesn't make you functionally strong. I've proven that to countless athletes on professional sports teams. So whenever you're laying on a machine, you don't need to use your core, and your brain won't turn it on. So you build great, big, strong arms. Then you have this wet noodle between them and your hips and your legs, which are also big and strong from things like knee extensions, hamstring curls, leg presses, Smith machines, etc. If you use a Smith machine, you're leaning against the machine. That'll shut your core off. And we had to pull. So pulling on vines, logs, branches, plants, tools, and even a freshly downed animal were all movements tied to survival as a primal human. Remember, all these are done without external support. And twisting. Twisting is the most complex pattern. The spinal joints have to go through a lot of complex movements to rotate. And this is why the twist pattern begins in utero while the child is in water, fluid, so it can move around and rotate its spine, which is why you see feet and hands poking one place and then another place, and mothers can feel those little appendages moving all around in there. And so the child's actually conditioning the cartilage and the ligaments and the muscles by using twisting movements in utero, so that when the fetus is exposed to gravity, it's got an adequate level of preconditioning. Otherwise, the system just wears out very quickly. So swinging a baseball bat, throwing a spear to hunt, throwing a rock to hunt or protect yourself in old times. There's a lot of ways we twist. Even a woman working at the cashier would be twisting to pass all your food items over the scanner. If you just look around, you'll see the twist is important. You can't even walk without twisting. So it turns out twisting is the catalyst pattern for most joints in the body. And if the twist pattern or the ability to rotate a joint diminishes, typically what you find next is that you lose movement in the other planes of joint movement as well. Then we have gait. Gait simply is a medical word or biomechanical word that means walking, jogging, and running. But what's important to understand based on sound scientific research is that walking, jogging, and sprinting are three separate programs in the nervous system. This is important, and I've demonstrated this importance to many physical therapists and rehabilitation doctors and osteopaths and chiropractors over my career, because oftentimes when athletes have pain while running, such as track and field athletes or sprinters, it's very rare that doctors and therapists will analyze their gait while running at the same speed that their pain is. They just do it in a clinic or in a hallway walking. And the walking pattern is not the same neurological pattern. It's like a different program. So you can have somebody that has pain jogging or sprinting, but doesn't show any signs of dysfunction walking, for a variety of different reasons. But mainly it's a different motor program. One could potentially argue that swimming could be an eighth pattern or a first pattern, but it would depend on what region of the world you were in. There's a lot of places in the world where humans did not have to swim, but you could potentially put swimming in there and it wouldn't be wrong. It would just be dependent upon the environment where people live. I think swimming is very important for survival reasons. So the punchline I was alluding to is that when I went to the Czech Republic and I began studying infant development, and then I came home and continued my studies of infant development, took more courses and studied many more books, all of a sudden it dawned on me that exactly the same movements, squat, lunge, bend, push, pull, twist, are exactly what an infant does. And the infant usually takes 10 to 12 months to get to where it can walk. But without going through each of the patterns in the infant development stage, I realized I had figured out human movement from an adult perspective, working backwards. And why that's important is because if there's infant development dysfunctions of any kind, it will disrupt your ability to do one or more of these 7 patterns, which will lead to orthopedic problems almost every single time. And the more stress you're under as far as accelerating your limbs, lifting heavy objects, working on a construction site, etc., the faster that pattern will result in compensations that lead to pain and dysfunction. So the moment I figured this out, it was like life force energy rushed through my body like I was having a cosmic orgasm. And I went, oh my God, I figured this out backwards. So whenever you have those kind of experiences, when you're, really deep into something, it's very, very special. Now, I will point out that one of the most dangerous things you can do, I alluded to it before, is do a lot of crunching off a floor. Quite simply, what happens is as you contract a muscle in a shortened position, it drops what are called sarcomeres, which are the contractile units of a muscle. So if you were to do half a biceps curl on the top half over time, it would shorten that muscle. Your arm would stop hanging straight. And many of you have noticed if you go to the gym where there's a lot of bodybuilders, their arms hang bent like monkeys or chimpanzees because they have disrupted the balance between the elbow flexors and elbow extensors. Now, if you look at my diagram, you see a model in a diagram going over a Swiss ball. Think of when you're serving a tennis ball. It turns out that our spine can extend, depending on the flexibility of the individual, between 35 and about 70 degrees behind where the floor would be. So think of how you arch your back to accelerate your racket to hit a tennis ball, or reaching up above your head to paint a wall if you're a painter using a roller, or someone working on the ceiling above them putting up drywall or painting the ceiling, or putting things away in high cupboards, or catching a baseball way up above your head. Now, to put this into perspective, something you'll all be very aware of, when a woman gets pregnant, the fetus grows, and as the fetus grows, as you know, her belly gets bigger and bigger. So as the fetus grows and develops, it stretches the rectus abdominis and the external obliques. And research by Goldspink showed a very long time ago that whenever you put chronic stretch on muscles, they add sarcomeres. When you put chronic tension through them in a shortened position, they drop sarcomeres and shorten. So since women seem to have this fanaticism with crunches, I showed a woman here, but what happens is that causes the abdominal muscles to shorten, pulls the chest down. But when the woman's baby gets bigger and bigger, the abdominal muscles add more and more sarcomeres. But then when she gives birth, most women will be able to tell you exactly what their abdominal wall looked like. It looked flabby and flaccid because it takes time for those sarcomeres to reabsorb. And after a woman gives birth, for the next 2 or 3 months, it's very dangerous for her to go into a gym and do things like CrossFit and start jumping around, throwing implements and swinging kettlebells, because it takes time for the body to physically and neurologically adapt so it could control the body and stabilize the joints properly. So what you get with a lot of isolated abdominal exercise, and even things like planking's very dangerous if your inner unit's not working, because you train the brain to use the outer unit muscles to stabilize the body, and they're not designed for that. They're not designed for long-term holds. Remember, they're predominantly fast twitch. So if your outer unit system runs out of energy and you start having a spine that can't stabilize, you're actually training dysfunction right into the body. So the picture you see on your screen shows a girl outlined in green with normal posture, and the one in red shows exactly what you're likely to look like if you keep doing crunches off the floor and you don't do adequate stretching and corrective exercise and strengthening the back extensors in order to lengthen those abdominal muscles to discourage them from shortening. You not only shorten the rectus abdominis, you shorten the internal obliques and the external obliques. It causes a lot of problems, is what I'm saying.
Your mind is capable of more than scattered thinking, midday fatigue, and diminished focus. Correct Edge delivers a smooth, cognitive experience powered by paraxanthine, which is the refined metabolite of caffeine that delivers elevated mental clarity without overstimulation. Correct Edge is built around a tri-pathway system designed to optimize what simple caffeine never could: the dopamine pathways that govern motivation, task initiation, and sustained cognitive drive. In addition to paraxanthine, it contains energy amplifiers in extra made from Alpinia galanga root and Zynamite, a mango leaf extract, to support dopamine levels and create a juggernaut of mental and physical energy. Whether you're doing complex work, tackling demanding projects, or navigating a long day, Edge delivers cognitive drive and keeps you locked in right when you need it. It comes in a delicious, natural, sugar-free mango flavor, packed in on-the-go sticks for easy use whenever you need an edge for the mind and body. Try Correct's new Edge and save 20% when you go to correctlife.com/spiritgym and use the coupon code SpiritGym. That's a 20% discount using the code SpiritGym at correctlife.com/spiritgym.
Now, getting into some very important issues that few people are aware of. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see ENS control, relationships. That stands for enteric nervous system. Simply put, that's the solar plexus or sun plexus. It is the sun plexus in you that takes the energy put into food by photosynthesis and extracts it so your body can use it. So you can take light that was in form and dismantle the form and create light and energy and get the nutrition out of it so your body can use it. Now, the dotted circle represents your intestinal tract, your small intestine particularly, or the enteric system from mouth to anus. But most important in this conversation is the small intestine, because that's where you absorb food through. Only a few things come through the stomach, but most of it comes through the small intestine. Now, pay special attention to the fact that all the research on the microbiome is showing us how critical the microbiome is to our overall health and mental health, emotional health, physical health, physiological health, every aspect of our body. And our mind and our biochemistry and our hormonal system is influenced by the microbiome, which has a lot to do with the diversity of the foods, the quality of the foods, and the source of the foods that we're eating, because that determines the bacterial profile, what microorganisms are in there, what parasites are or are not in there, what nutrition is in there, and what genes are in there. And it turns out having a vast genetic diversity in food is very important to the body. I don't have time to go into a detailed explanation of the microbiome, but there's some very good presenters and people like Sayer G and others out there talking about it. There's entire books on it now. But the point I want you to see is notice those bidirectional arrows running from the enteric nervous system or solar plexus, showing that the enteric nervous system has a regulatory function on the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic or fight or flight branch, and the parasympathetic digest, metabolize, regenerate, eliminate system, the limbic system, which is what processes emotion in your brain, and your somatic system, which is the tissues of your body and your muscles and your connective tissues. Each of those systems that I just listed also has an influence on the enteric nervous system, and the enteric nervous system has an influence on them. That's called bidirectional communication. So there's a constant dialogue between the autonomic nervous system, the hormonal system, the limbic emotional system, and the tissues of the body, and the gut microbiome, and the gut itself. What you have to understand is that your organs do not have their own sensory fibers. They don't have their own sensory nerves. They borrow them from the nerve fibers that give sensation to your musculoskeletal system and your skin. Nobody walks into a doctor's office and says, "Doctor, my heart hurts." But they do say, "I have pain in my left chest and arm, and I have shortness of breath." And the doctor knows immediately to do an electrocardiogram and do the necessary test to see if they're having a heart condition or a potential onset of a heart attack. Oftentimes, women don't feel pain in their uterus. They feel pain in their low back, down their legs, around their nipples, and to the base of their skull, because of the reflex pathways and how the uterus gets its sensory innervation. So in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, I show you, as you can see right on the screen, what spinal segments feed the sensation to each of the organs in your body. And therefore, you know which muscles, anybody that knows basic anatomy knows which muscles. For example, L4 is your quadriceps. We talked about your abdominal muscles going through T7 all the way to L1, sometimes L2 in some bodies. And so that'll affect all your digestive muscles. So anytime you have inflammation or dysfunction in any of your glands or organs, it will produce changes in the muscles. Now, a simple way to think about this is think of what happens to women when they're premenstrual and their uterus begins to slough the internal lining. It swells because there's inflammation going on, and it causes the lower abdomen to distend. The reason is the uterus shuts down the tone in the lower abdominal muscles to make more room for the swollen uterus. If it didn't, it would decrease blood supply to the uterus and significantly slow the rate at which oxygen and nutrition could get in and waste removal could get taken away, which would lead to a very serious problem with our ability to perpetuate the species. And so what do women do? They go to the gym and do thousands of crunches because they don't like their distended abdomen, not realizing that they're doing something that's not a good idea at all. In fact, there's a book I have in my library written by some of the experts from the Australian Institute of Sport. They found that a tremendous number of women in track and field and Olympic sports got injured when they were premenstrual or during their menstrual cycle, but male coaches predominantly kept pushing them like men, and a very high percentage of them had career-ending injuries because they were pushing themselves too hard while menstruating, and their body could not stabilize. Remember, the pelvic floor and the abdominal wall and the multifidus and the diaphragm are all part of a working system with other muscles that we alluded to. So if you're eating anything that's causing inflammation in your gut, such as gluten or medical drugs or food chemicals, additives, preservatives, colorings, emulsifiers, stabilizers, glyphosate, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, and on goes the list, you will be triggering an inflammatory response in one or more or many organs, which will then reflexively inhibit the muscles in that region to make room for them to swell due to the inflammatory process. And so people go to the gym and work the hell out of themselves because they don't like it, not realizing that they're actually setting themselves up for a lot of injuries and a lot of faulty recruitment, because you can't get the brain to turn the muscle on when the body's trying to shut it off for survival reasons. You just won't be able to do it effectively. And the totem pole shows you that the organs are way higher on the survival strategy than the muscles are. The muscles are the servants to the organs, as I'll allude to in a minute. So the areas you see in color on my diagram point out where you're likely to feel pain if you're having problems with the organs of the same color on my diagram. Point is, you can never have optimal conditioning and optimal strength development or speed development or power development if you don't have healthy glands and organs. And our lack of this understanding is one of the common reasons that steroids are rampant in sports, because people try to take shortcuts, because no matter how hard they try to train or how many supplements they take or how much biohacking they do, they can't keep up with the athletes that do know how to take care of themselves and have better performance. So next thing you know, everybody's juicing it up, let alone the fact of all the complications that causes with the liver, with the detoxification system, with imbalancing the hormonal system. But using faulty exercises and doing heavy weightlifting and causing significant levels of strength development hypertrophy on a system that's not working properly, which is like putting 500 horsepower in your Volkswagen, but not improving the brakes or the suspension or putting better tires on it so it goes like hell in a straight line, but God bless you if you try to turn it or stop it. One of my favorite books and one of my favorite people, Eugene Sandow, who I believe it's the Mr. Olympia trophy in bodybuilding is a statue of Eugene Sandow. He was one of the strongest men in the world for a very long time. In his excellent book written, I believe, in 1928 called Life is Movement, he states in there very clearly, no man can achieve optimal strength until all his glands and organs are healthy. So much for all our advanced conditioning methods and our advanced supplements and our advanced gadgets and biohacking. People have got it backwards. Additionally, when you have all these organ problems and you have inflammation in the abdominal wall or unresolved orthopedic injuries, and poor posture, you can develop what is called viscerotosis, visceral organ ptosis, hanging or lack of support. So if the core is working properly, you'll look like the girl in the upper left here. Notice her breasts are up and in a nice, beautiful posture, and her abdominal wall has a normal posture to it, and her organs are properly held and supported by the abdominal wall and the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. But once you start irritating these organs for any reason, they reflexively shut down the abdominal wall because they swell up due to all the inflammation, and sometimes chronic gas and bloating and parasite infections and fungal infections. There's a lot of things that can do this. So what you see here is these organs have fallen down, which puts tremendous pressure on the ligaments which attach to the spine, which causes abnormal loading of the spine, which leads to joint problems and pain and neurological complications and everything you can imagine. And I have a great podcast with Chek professional Matt Sorensen on visceral manipulation, which is all about restoring the normal position and movement of the organs to restore health throughout the body and in the musculoskeletal system. Also, you can see a normal position of the uterus here, but when this falls down, the uterus is getting compressed, which can cause tremendous problems for females and even uterine prolapse if it gets bad enough, which I've seen cases of. It can cause anal prolapse. It causes incontinence, is very, very common. Point being is you cannot have a flat abdominal wall, good posture, and good, healthy, strong muscles and joints if your internal organs and glands aren't working properly. It is impossible. Over my years of study, I developed a series of maps to help me quickly recognize which things were connected to what. So here's one of the maps from my Holistic Lifestyle Coach Level 3 program. And so what I'm showing you here is the sensory distribution. The liver gets its sensory input from the same nerves that come from T5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, which feed the upper right region of the rectus abdominis, the upper right region of your abdominal wall. So problems in the liver often cause distension of the abdominal wall. You'll notice a lot of bodybuilders using steroids have great big sticky out bellies that almost look like they're pregnant. That's because the inflammation of the liver from the steroids and the hypertrophy of the liver causes the abdominal wall muscles to have to stick out. And oftentimes the brain doesn't want them exercising those muscles, because every time you go to the gym and work out and spend energy and resources to fire muscles, you're spending nutrition, oxygen, and resources that needs to be diverted into the organs to help your body heal. And that's why I coined the term fit sick people, for which I've seen a countless number of them, and many professional athletes end their careers by being fit sick people. Now, some other things here. If there's problems in the liver, it can send pain into the regions here in the upper trapezius and neck region, right upper abdominal region, and right down here where your lower trapezius is on the right side. It causes pain in these reflex points that you see in the hands and the feet. It causes headaches in this distribution. People often have pain just below the ear and the back of the jaw. And this can come from cavities or infections or damage of different types, such as malocclusion, putting too much pressure on the teeth that you see in my diagram here. Now, what's important is that we have two kinds of reflexes coming from organs that affect muscles: viscero-inhibitory and viscero-excitatory. Sometimes organs will cause muscles to be too excited and go into spasm, because if there's too much energy, such as someone drinking Red Bull all the time or Monster, it can overload the liver and stress the liver. And so it will send energy into the muscles that it links to, which in this case is the upper right and all the muscles where you see pain distribution. And so you get spasm because the body's actually trying to use muscle contraction to dissipate energy out of that organ to protect it. Remember, the word disease means dis-ease, too much excitement. So organ problems can cause muscles to spasm and to be too tight, which disrupts oxygen flow, disrupts blood delivery, disrupts waste removal, and leads to a chain of negative problems that often soft tissue therapists and massage therapists are repeatedly treating symptomatically, but not tracking it backward to the cause, unfortunately. Whenever you have dysfunction in glands or organs and dysfunction in related muscles, you're going to have related disruption in the joint system. And so you will see classic joints getting restricted, such as the ribs and related vertebra in the case of the liver, the sternum, the costal cartilage, disorders of the throat, restrictions of the suspensory ligament, and restrictions at the CT junction, NT1 through 4. And wherever you have a restriction in any joint, you will have hypermobility at the joint above or below it as a general theme. So in other words, these gland and organ problems can create tremendous problems disrupt the resistance contraction factor, which, by the way, I need to go back and tell you, well, you remember that RC factor diagram. If you have contraction in a muscle, such as, let's say, your liver's causing your abdominal muscles to be too tight to dissipate energy, that causes contraction. And if you don't generate enough resistance through the back extensors, then what'll happen is it'll pull your spine into flexion and alter your posture. For example, you've got muscles in the front of your neck, deep cervical flexors, and the muscles in the anterior neck, and then you got neck extensors. So if you have contraction for any reason in these muscles and you don't have a matched amount of resistance, it will alter your posture and your joint mechanics. So what you see here is the kind of person that we see in clinics all day long, and everybody keeps trying to fix this from the outside in, but rarely ever is it just an outside in job. If it was, then the correction would last. One of your telltale signs is people say, I feel better as long as I'm doing those exercises or those stretches, but as soon as I stop, I hurt again, which means you're treating the symptoms of a bigger problem that's coming from higher up in the Chek totem pole. And remember, all the cranial nerves can be related to all these problems, so it takes a fair bit of training for doctors, therapists, and Chek professionals to learn how to analyze the body correctly so they don't miss things.
If you have listened to even one episode of Paul's podcast before, then you will know that he is passionate, and some would say even fanatical, about the quality of the food he eats and where it is sourced from. That is why the Chek household only eats pasture-raised meat, wild-caught fish, and organic produce. And that is why we subscribe to Wild Pastures meat delivery service. Each month, Wild Pastures delivers a box of meat that has been raised by family farmers in the USA using regenerative farming practices. 100% grass-fed and finished beef, pasture-raised chicken, and pasture-raised pork, as well as wild-caught seafood. You can customize the selection in your box, add on extra when you know you will be feeding more people, or change your options each and every month. You might be thinking that this will be too expensive for you, but Wild Pasture's mission is to offer the highest quality meat at the lowest prices because they want to transform the meat industry. And that means that more people need to be able to choose meat that is raised right. Their pasture-raised animals are part of a natural ecosystem. Their farmers use rotational grazing, practices that mimic nature, and so do not need to use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. This beautiful process doesn't require the external resources, such as massive amounts of GMO grain, required with environmentally depleting conventional methods. And best of all, the meat and fish taste amazing. And for Paul's listeners, Wild Pastures are offering you 20% off your subscription for life, $15 off your first order, and free shipping. Seriously, you can't find a better deal for top quality pasture-raised meat. Go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek. You don't need a promo code. Just visit wildpastures.com/Paul Chek and start choosing the goodies you will have delivered to you in your first box.
Then we have mind-body correlation. Remember, the psyche's at the very top of the totem pole. So here what you see as zones in yoga are called chakras, which are energy vortexes. If you want to learn about the energy fields, listen to my episode 250, Lucifer, Christ, Ahriman. I go through all the energy fields in there, so you know exactly what they are. This is well documented. You can read the book, Cynthia Dale's book, DALE Sounds True. So what I'm showing you here is that these energy centers are related to our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs, and to different functions in our body. And each of these vortexes or chakras or zones is linked to hormonal glands and key functions in the body. So you can see them all. I won't go through them all. They're well listed for you. This information's in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy. This shows you what muscles are involved, and each of these zones are connected to these chakras. The seventh chakra is missing because it's related to the brain itself, but also to issues of what you think is going to happen to you when you die and what you believe God is or isn't. But this shows you how we can track back. So if someone has adrenal problems and their adrenals are fatigued, then chances are very good, for example, that they're going to have problems stabilizing the pelvis, legs, and feet for all the reasons I've just mentioned. So if we look at what are the main psychological themes that relate to the psyche and its influence on the body, zone 1, which is pelvis, legs, feet, adrenals, fight or flight response, bones, and skeletal structure, the most common cause of problems there is financial stress, anything that threatens your safety and security. Zone 2, stress over relationships and sex identity, which seems to be a growing issue. I think a lot of that is unfortunately part of the transgender movement and transhumanist movement. I don't think it's nearly as real as social media would make you believe, but it is a product of the breakdown of the human body and mind. If you read the book Pottinger's Cats and look what happened to his cats when he fed them processed food, by the third generation, the cats lost sex differentiation. Females were having sex with males, males were having sex with males, and it took 4 generations of feeding them raw food and raw milk to get them healthy again. They lost their athletic ability. They had tremendous problems with miscarriages and stillbirths, and etc. Zone 3, which is right in the region of your solar plexus, is all to do with personal power, self-will, and digestion. Zone 4, the region of the heart, stress over relationships and love. Zone 5 is communication and expressing yourself creatively and in relationships and in life. And zone 6 is mental congestion, lack of mental clarity, and lack of creativity or lack of using your creativity. So here you see how the psyche influences the physiology of the body. Remember, the mind is God to the body. If you think you're sad, you'll produce the hormones that give you the experience of sadness, and every single cell in your body will behave as though it's sad. This is why smiling is so therapeutic. If you smile, you're telling your brain and your hormonal system you're happy, produces happy chemicals, changes your posture, changes your gesture, changes the entire flow of energy in your body. So you can't have a functional body or a functional core if you're not doing the work to be mentally and emotionally healthy as well. And I've had to do tons of mental, emotional counseling and healing work with people from all walks of life and athletes to resolve athletic injuries, sports injuries, work injuries that wouldn't heal. Now, remember, each of your organs, and I've tested this thoroughly, according to traditional Chinese medicine, has the ability to generate classic emotions, key emotions. So, for example, when we look at heart, we're dealing with issues of love. The heart and small intestine are linked together energetically. So when we're dealing with negative emotions around love and emotions of hate and cruelty, they have negative effects on the heart. And if the heart and lungs are unhealthy, you're more susceptible to those emotions. When the liver, the eyes, or the gallbladder are in trouble, we're more likely to feel anger, frustration, jealousy, and envy. Many of my patients that had anger issues were able to completely heal from it just by doing detoxification protocols, and their whole mental emotional profile changed. The kidney, ears, and bladder deal with the emotion of fear. So if they're unhealthy, you'll experience more fear. It's them talking to you saying help. And if you are creating fear unnecessarily or in an environment where fear is natural, such as the COVID lockdowns, it puts tremendous stress on the kidneys, ears, and bladder. The skin, lungs, and large intestine are also related to sadness and depression, and lungs are also related to grief. Spleen, stomach, and pancreas in traditional Chinese medicine connect to the emotions of worry, anxiety, and mistrust. So remember, you see my lines here going to the limbic system. I said this is a floating symbol, which means if this gets to be bad enough, you can not only go into depression and apathy, but commit suicide. And so these energy centers are very vital because there's nothing more real than what you perceive to be real. So if you perceive that you're afraid, or you perceive that someone doesn't love you, or that nobody loves you, etc., your body acts it out as though it's absolutely real. So think of all the times you've convinced yourself someone didn't love you, or that you were not going to be able to pay the rent, or this was going to fall apart, or you were going to get fired, but it didn't happen. Well, it's most of the time, but your body suffers. This is why spiritual development is so desperately needed, because unfortunately, most religions don't teach us how to manage our mind and emotions as well as our body in an integrated system. And oftentimes we get programmed into dogmas that make us afraid of God and afraid of other people, and it's just not good. And so we're talking about the core of movement. We're talking about the movement of the body. We're talking the movement of emotional energy. We're talking about the movement of mental energy. We're talking about the movement of spirit, not just the body. This comes from my senior instructor, Matthew Wald's 5-dimensional mastery model. As we evolve with infant development and our normal development and athletic development, we first need to learn to move in rotation. As I said, in utero it begins. Then the frontal plane, which is if you bend side to side, sagittal plane, front to back, transverse plane is rotation. So if you're doing a horizontal chopping exercise, like a cable twist, keeping the cable at navel level, you'd be doing a transverse movement. Then we evolve into self-mastery with regard to our use of time and our mind. And then we evolve spiritually to what's called the 0 point, our union with all that is. So this is a simplified model of neurological complexity, which is also psycho-neurocomplexity. And you could call it psycho-neurophysical. And this is the basis of a lot of psychoneuroimmunology and psychosocial medicine. Now, just to make a point here, breathing is number 2 position on the totem pole. Breathing pattern disorders are extremely common, and your mind directly impacts your breathing immediately. If your mind thinks you're afraid, it'll change your breathing and your posture and your muscle tone and the hormones you regulate, etc., etc. And if you breathe properly, because you're consciously doing it, you can actually ease and begin to heal and open your mind up to see what you're holding on to as judgments and fears. So breathing turns out to be extremely critical. But this little chart, which I modified a little bit to make it more comprehensive, comes from an excellent little book called Breathe to Succeed in All Aspects of Your Life, published by Penguin Global. The author is Tanya Clifton Smith. Now, the more points you get, the more serious of a breathing problem you have, and the more important it is. So here's some of the common symptoms of a breathing pattern disorder: fatigue, muscle aches and pains, sighing and yawning, headaches, insomnia, dizziness, chest pain and tightness, gastric reflux or nausea, such as belching up stomach acid, anxiety, pins and needles, often in your fingers and little finger and ring finger, or anywhere in your body, could be all over your body, feelings of panic and loss of control, bad breath, bloating, flatulence, which is gas if you're not familiar with that word, poor concentration, temperature changes in your body, racing heart, vivid dreams or nightmares, like unusually vivid, chest moving before expansion of the belly when you inhale, irritable cough, a foggy head, eye strain, shortness of breath, and feelings of electric shock. Now ask yourself, how much money do you think is spent on drugs and or surgeries to treat those things we've just covered every single day, most of which I would guess 85 to 90% of them can completely be alleviated through a combination of breathing and diet lifestyle practices? The drug industry is not at all interested in the kinds of things I'm telling you. Neither is the medical industry, because it's a disease maintenance system, not a healthcare system. I show you exercises, I believe, read out of my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, for how to breathe properly And a simple technique I use is you just lay on your back with your knees bent, feet flat on the ground. You take a water bottle, like your typical Evian bottle, only put about, 2.5 or so inches in it so it's bottom heavy. Set it right on your belly button. As you inhale, focus on the first 2/3 of the breath, expanding your belly so the bottle rises. And by feeling the weight of the bottle, it helps your brain know how to change the tension in the muscles so you relax your belly. And only in the last 1/3 should the chest come up, and you should only breathe in as deeply as you can without causing tension in the upper trapezius or neck muscles, or you'll develop a faulty breathing pattern. On exhalation, you can feel the weight of the bottle. You just let your body exhale naturally. Typically, I have people do 12 what I call centering breaths, diaphragmatic breaths, every hour on the hour throughout the day by setting a watch or a beeper so they can retrain the breathing system. There's many foods, drugs and food additives and chemicals that can disrupt your breathing pattern, but it's not just as simple as doing the right exercise. You have to do a comprehensive analysis of a person's diet and lifestyle to see how their chemistry and their psychology is disrupting their breathing. But by working at both ends, mind and body, we can get rapid results, and that's what Chek professionals are trained to do. Finally, we have to look at the balance of the left and right brain hemispheres. Our right brain hemisphere is where we see things in their wholeness and where our creativity emerges from. But our left brain hemisphere is where our habitual patterns are, our ability to put things in linear and to cut things out of the pie, so to speak, see things in parts. And the more stressed we are, the more of a fight or flight reaction we're having, the more left brain dominant we become, because we resort back to conditioned behaviors and patterns. Because in a survival threat, we don't have time to be creative. That's why I say it's a bad idea to throw in a cartwheel if you're running from a lion. It'll get you eaten. So we have to be super careful that we understand some of these basics, or the basis of movement physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually gets disrupted. And anything that disrupts you at the core of your being, the core of your sense of who you are, the core of your diet, your lifestyle, your relationships, your sense of self, your ability to give and receive love, to express yourself, to communicate, to have insight, to trust your instincts, your intuition, and to get past conditioned beliefs about God and what God will do to you and what God wants. And all these things, nobody can know what God wants until they become God. And when you do, there's no you there to report anything back. So we have to be super careful about just memorizing stuff out of books and believing it, because it leads to tremendous physical, mental, emotional, and relationship problems. So this is just a brief summary of things that I think are essential to know, and why I wanted to do this podcast, to share this with you. So we also want to remember, as I show in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, we shouldn't just do general stretching. The body has to be finely tuned and balanced. Think of your body like a musical instrument. Each string is akin to a muscle on the body. Think of a bicycle wheel. If you just stretch a crooked wheel and lengthen all the spokes, you have a loose crooked wheel. If you tighten all the spokes, you have a tight, brittle, crooked wheel. To balance a wheel, you have to tighten what's loose and loosen what's too tight. So in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, I show you 20 key stretch tests you can do to identify exactly what muscles in your body need to be addressed. And then you can look at the piano spine diagram to see which organs and glands are connected to see what diet and lifestyle factors you got to look into, so you can create a holistic balance, or you'll just be stretching till the cows come home and it won't have long-term results. When it comes to conditioning, we have to first identify which inner unit muscles. Remember, the inner unit's not just for the core. You have an inner unit for your knee, an inner unit for your shoulder, inner unit for your neck, your foot and your ankle. So there's inner unit systems throughout the body, wherever there's outer unit systems, because that's how you stabilize joints. Once we isolate and activate the muscles that aren't working, which can take some skill to figure out how to do, that's why we have to have training. Then we go to inner unit, outer unit integration. So we use things like Swiss ball exercises and a variety of other exercises to integrate those two systems. Only then can we do integrated strength training, which we would call functional strength training. And only then do we do sport-specific training or power training, high-speed movements of any kind. If you get that backwards, which almost the entire exercise industry has it backwards, you just keep the medical system busy. You keep using a lot of drugs and making a lot of mistakes that cause a lot of pain, ruin a lot of athletic careers, stop people from being able to play with their grandkids, and have people have to have career changes because of pain and get stuck in desks, and on it goes. So in my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, there's a series of questionnaires that allows you to identify which systems of your body are under too much stress. And then the book guides you to what chapters to read, what exercises, what stretches, what joint mobilizations, what diet and lifestyle changes to make to bring yourself back into harmony. If your total score, which you see on the far right column, is less than 150, then you can freely choose exercises based on individual needs, your abilities, and your conditioning level. If your score is between 150 and 250, that's a warning. Exercise intensity should not exceed that which allows normal breathing while performing a movement, or you should not go heavier with weightlifting than something you can lift 16 to 30 times, or you'll put too much stress on your body and develop faulty movement patterns and faulty breathing patterns, and on it goes from there. If your score is 260 to 634, which unfortunately about 95% of the people that take these tests are, you need to take caution. Work in. In my book, I show you how to work in. I give you several different types for the different zones. And that means doing exercises that do not elevate your heart rate, do not elevate your respiratory rate, and that keep your tongue moist. If your tongue dries out, that means you're going sympathetic. And these exercises should be comfortable to do on a full stomach. And these exercises bring life force energy into the body and give you the vitality you need to heal, to strengthen, and to have the resources to make the changes you need to lower your score, to do everything that you want to do that makes you happy. As we close here, let's look at what is stability. We've talked about physical stability, emotional stability, mental stability, and I alluded to spiritual stability. Stability is created as a harmony between the physical, physiological, and perceptual systems of the body, emotions, and mind. Stability arises as a dynamic, instinctually guided interaction between the individual's inner and outer ecological and psychosocial environments. When we fail to develop holistically in childhood, have unresolved wounds, addictions, or ideological biases that distort our capacity for integrated perception and response, our capacity for life is limited and we fail to thrive. Yet, we can learn how to eat, move, and be healthy at any stage of our life process, and Chek professionals are trained to support you in regaining your freedom and living your dreams. I'm so proud that we have had something like 63,000 people come through the Institute since I started it in 1995. And many of them, there's probably been 50 books written by Chek professionals. Many of them have started healing centers, resort centers, have created healthy organic foods and food companies, and on goes the list. Chek professionals have been an amazing force of healing in the world and will continue to be, hopefully long after I'm gone. So thank you for joining me. Once again, suggested resources. Feel free for more information or interaction with me. You can join the Spirit Gym program and community, which helps you go through all of this at a deep level with my guidance. We have a great community of approximately, close to 600 people at different levels of membership. And you're welcome to go to myspiritgym.com and check it out. So thank you, you guys. Hope you enjoyed the presentation. Wish I could have got deeper into a lot of topics, but some of these things take time, training, practice, hands-on. Thanks for all of you for being the change the world needs now. Thank you to my sponsors for all your love, support, excellent products. Thank you to all of you for anything you buy from the sponsors. They get their materials from organic and biodynamic and free-range farmers, so you're supporting yourself, you're supporting companies that make you great products to help you heal and be vital, and your family, keep your family healthy and vital, and you're supporting the farmers that take care of our planet, and you're supporting the podcast. If you want to write a positive comment for the podcast on the platform that you're on, I'd appreciate it. And lots of love. Can't wait to see what I've got coming up for you next. Aho, great spirit. We are safe. We are home. We are whole. Lots of love.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek. Check out the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast to access the PDF accompaniment to this episode. You can also fill out the NLC assessment that Paul talked about at nlc.chekinstitute.com. Make sure to follow Paul on his social media, Instagram and TikTok at paul.chek, X at paulchek, and his YouTube channel, youtube.com/Paul Chek Live. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. This show is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube. And finally, please support our sponsors, Chek Institute, Organifi, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, Wild Pastures, Peak Life, and Correct, as their support of this podcast helps us to keep bringing new episodes to you.